Charlotte Dubin. I'm conducting an oral history interview with Stuart Hertzberg for the Leonard N. Simons Jewish Community Archives at the Max M. Fisher Federation Building on September 23, 2004. Mr. Hertzberg, do we have your permission to use your words and thoughts in the future for educational and historical research and documentation?
You certainly do.
Thank you. From the beginning, where and when were you born?
I was born on November 24th, 1926 in the city of Detroit.
And who were your parents?
Both my parents are deceased. My mother was Rachel Hertzberg. Her maiden name was Horowitz. And my father was Barnett Hertzberg, and he went by the name of Barney.
And where were they from? Can you tell us a little about their beginnings here in Detroit?
My mother was from the Ukraine. I'm not sure what town. I know it was the Ukraine. She came over when she was 5 years of age, had led me to believe, which was typical of people in those days, that she was born in the United States. So all the way through the 12th grade, I had represented my mother was born in the United States. When I was going into service in the Second World War, she was afraid somebody was going to deport her or something, and for the first time she told me she was born in Russia or in the Ukraine. My father was born in England, and his parents came from Latvia.
Did you ever have any connection with your grandparents?
Yes, my mother's parents were both alive during my childhood. I think I was probably about 8 years or 9 years of age when my mother's father died, and I was in my late teens when my mother's mother died, and she was one of my favorites. My dad's father I never met, know very little about him, and his mother lived to 105 years of age. So there's quite a bit of longevity there.
Do you have some memories of your grandmother?
Which one? My mother's mother I used to see her every Saturday morning because all the kids would go over to Stuart Hertzberg, stand on the steps, and then usually they'd let us in to go upstairs during part of the service there. And then I'd go over to my grandmother's house, who lived on Rochester in Detroit, and I'd have lunch, and she always said to me, "Stuart, darling, you're sweet like sugar." And it's a saying, and I'll never forget. And she was quite a gal. And my dad's mother, she lived in the East, and I think, met her for the first time when she was probably in her 70s, 70, 75 years of age. I think I went in once on the honeymoon in New York and met my grandmother, but I didn't see her for quite some time until she moved to Detroit and began to live with my father until she died.
What was your home like?
A very close family. Of course, the Second World War intervened during my childhood, and my dad worked as the superintendent manager and then general manager of what was then Guardian Glass Company, and they were supplying glass to the defense industry, and he was not around, as most fathers were not in those days who were working in the defense industries. And so I saw mostly my mother, but I was quite close to them.
Did you have siblings?
I had a brother. I still have a brother and a sister, and my sister and I were very close when we were growing up together. My brother left at 18 years of age to go into service in the Second World War, and I was 14 at that time, so we didn't have contact for 4 or 5 years there. But there was a close sibling relationship.
Was there a Jewish influence in your home?
Well, my mother and dad spoke Jewish when they didn't want me to understand them. They attended services. We joined Temple Bethel, and I used to accompany them to Temple Bethel. And there was the Friday night Shabbat dinner, but sometimes instead of chicken, the Shabbat dinner was delicatessen. But that was about it. I think most Jews in those days were really assimilating. And my mother and father were, at the best I can recall, were really not active in any of the Jewish agencies or organizations, but they did identify as Jews. And I certainly knew that I was Jewish, etc., and there was no question about that, that all the children knew that.
Did they send you to Hebrew school?
Yes, I went to Hebrew school, and Rabbi Lawton was the main teacher during those days, and he had a little, he was above a store on Tuxedo and Linwood in the city of Detroit, and he was quite a character, and so was I, and he finally threw me out of class. So as a result, my bar mitzvah was delayed till I was an adult. And they threw me out of class, but that was typical because I was, I think from the first grade all the way through to the 12th grade, I was thrown out of class every year, and my parents had to come back and get me back into class. So it was a pattern in those days, unfortunately.
Let's hear more about that. What made them throw you out of class?
I was an actor in class, and I would disrupt the class. And I was, scholastically, I always did very well, and that puzzled them. They could never understand that. But there was so much disruption in the class that they had to send me home, and then I was always scared of my father, so that when my father had to come to class, I knew I was in trouble, and that would straighten me out for the rest of the year. But at the same time, it was a pattern that carried on all the way through school.
What did you do for fun after school?
Played sports. We were over in that complex of Central High School, Durfee Intermediate, and Roosevelt, and they had incredible playgrounds over there. And in those days, you had multiple housing, 2 flats and 4 flats and apartment buildings, so there was just tons of kids in the area to play with. And we'd head over to the, it was about 3 blocks away, we'd head over to the complex there, and we'd play sports. And I was also, as a kid, a member of the Habonim and the Hatzayer, Hashomer Hatzayer, Jewish Boy Scouts, and so that was a little sidelight. Here I was, a member of those organizations, and I'd never had a bar mitzvah at that time. But I was interested and enjoyed it.
Those organizations are Israel-oriented. What impact was Israel having on your life?
Not very much at that time. I guess it was socializing with the other kids and enjoying what we were doing and being a Jewish Boy Scout that I found attractive. Israel had a tremendous impact on my life, and which I guess we'll get to later, when I went over there in 1967, right after the Six-Day War.
Who are your friends?
Most of them, unfortunately, are deceased right now. Closest friends were Ron Stone, who was in the advertising business, who recently died, and Herbert Silman, and Jerry Rohn, and we were all close together, and most of my friends carried right over from high school into the adult world, and we were very close. And unfortunately, as I said before, most of them are deceased.
Tell us a little bit about high school.
I was active in sports. I lettered in swimming and in track, and then because of my troubles in the school, I was ineligible. Not that I wasn't passing classes, but because of the way I was carrying on, and so as a result, they said I couldn't play on the baseball team and the basketball team. I was active in the civics club. I enjoyed high school. but I had to repeat some of the classes during the summer because I was in trouble all the time. But we straightened that out when I went to college. As a matter of fact, I'll never forget, I came back from service, and I always said that that's the best thing that could happen to any kid, as long as there wasn't a war going on. Unfortunately, there was a war going on. But it straightened you out pretty fast, and I came back and I told my mother I wanted to go to college, and I wanted to go to the University of Michigan. And she couldn't believe either one of them. And so that period comes after the high school, but I enjoyed the high school. I liked the social life, and I did very well in many of the scholastic subjects. The subjects I didn't do so well on, I just didn't go to class.
Tell us about your war experience now. You were 19 when you went into the Army?
No,
right
I
out
was,
of high school? Or?
I was 18. I was 18 and perhaps 3 months, 2 or 3 months. The war was still on, and I went into basic training down in Texas, and I was in the infantry. And they shipped us over, and while I was on shipboard, going over to the Pacific, the atomic bomb had been dropped. And when we landed, I guess we landed before the war was over, but I was in occupation then for a period of almost 2 years in the Philippines.
What was that like?
Again, I enjoyed it very much. The war was over. I was first in charge of the athletics and recreation and played basketball and other sports over there with the headquarters AF Westpac team, and then I became a editor of the unit newspaper for the Highway Transport Service, which won a commendation and award over there as one of the best newspapers, and ended up then as the chief clerk of the Athletics and Recreation Division, and I was a staff sergeant. And I really enjoyed the experience, meeting the people, new culture, a different kind of a culture. Many of my friends hated it, couldn't wait till they get back. I enjoyed it very much. And it really straightened me out, I can tell you.
How did it do that? What did it do?
Pardon?
How did that happen?
I made up my mind that I was going to straighten out my life. I was, by this time, 19 years of age. I knew I was going to be getting out within a year, and decided that I wanted to go to college. And I didn't have the slightest idea of what I wanted to do, but I wanted to go to college, and I wrote my mother that and my father, and they were delighted to hear that. And I came back, and I guess it was, I'm trying to think, I came back in 1946, I believe it was, and started in 47, and I did not monkey around at all in college. I enjoyed college, but I paid attention to what I was doing. Paid attention to my studies. Discipline was not a problem. And as I said before, I've always said, if we could only draft these kids into the service for a year with no war going on, it'd be the best thing for them. It was for me anyway.
You were on the GI Bill?
Yes. I was on the GI Bill all the way through law school, which was of great help.
Can you describe your decision-making when you were, and this was the University of Michigan, how did you decide to go into law?
I really don't know. I was fascinated with politics at that time, and I noticed that many of the kids on campus who were active in politics were in the law school. I was fairly articulate and interested in political science and other courses like that led me to think that perhaps law is something I would enjoy. There were no lawyers in my family. My 3 kids are all lawyers now, but there were no lawyers in my family, so there was no precedent. And I just decided that I wanted to go to law school. And my parents were very surprised to hear that, but delighted. And then I was an honorary graduate. I graduated with a Juris Doctor with distinction. And that was the start of my career of 50 years in the practice of law.
Did you have any influences on you, any mentors, anyone who helped you shape your life?
Well, the mentors really came at the time that I got active in the Jewish community. I had been extremely active in politics, and Avron Cohen and Mike Zeltzer, who were both presidents of the Jewish Federation at one time or another, worked under me in the area of finance. I was the treasurer of the Democratic Party for years before I became National Committeeman, and I was the finance chair. And we were extremely close, and they kept insisting that I had to get involved in the Jewish community. So they were my mentors in that particular vein.
To step back for a moment, as you mentioned you went through university on the GI Bill. You also, I believe, along the way, were married.
Yes, we got married when my wife was 18, which was fairly common in those days. And I went through summer school, the first year in law school, and then she came up and spent the next, I got through law school in 2.5 years. And she spent the next 2.5 years with me in Ann Arbor, and lots of good times. Struggles, but lots of good times. Her father was in the supermarket business, so that we had food. I had the GI Bill. My dad sent a little bit of money up there, and Marilyn worked while I was going through law school up in Ann Arbor in various capacities. So it was a joyful experience up there.
And when you graduated, tell me about the path you were taking.
Well, I did extremely well in law school, and I at first was interested in taxation. I got an A in that particular class, and the professor was very close to me, Professor Elhart Wright, and he suggested that I go to Washington, and I discussed the possibilities of becoming a clerk for Justice Rice of the tax court. Marilyn was only 19 and a half, 20 years of age at the time, and decided she didn't want to leave Detroit. That's where her parents were, and I had to make a decision where I wanted to go. And Professor Wright also taught bankruptcy, and I did very well in that course, and I was very fascinated with that course. So I went to see Ben Jaffe, who was the #1 bankruptcy lawyer in the state of Michigan, at Weisswasser, Jaffe, and Radner, and decided I wanted to become a bankruptcy lawyer. And I interned with them for about a year, and then I went out on my own.
As a bankruptcy lawyer, you've become nationally known. Are there any particular cases that you can recall?
Many. I eventually represented the national food manufacturers and the National Health and Beauty Aid people, and as a result, I was in every major food and drugstore reorganization around the country, and where they were the largest creditors, I was in other types of cases, but my entree was through this group, and I represented mostly creditors committees, although I did do some bankruptcy work. I mean some debtor work. And I was involved in the WICS reorganization in California, which in 1982 to 84 was the largest bankruptcy that had ever been filed in the country. And I represented the Creditors Committee. And then I was in major reorganizations like the Revco drugstores, the Farmore drugstores, God, there was just so many of them, like Wilson Foods. Could go on and on. Any major reorganization over a 20-year period, 25-year period that had been filed in the United States, I represented the food group and the health and beauty aid group there. So I, as a result, became counsel for the Creditors Committee and developed a national reputation in that area.
What qualities does it take to be a bankruptcy lawyer?
Well, you had if you represented creditors committees like I did, over the overwhelming percentage of that period, you had to be able to, although you were not chairman of the committee, you had to be able to control the activities of the committee. And my experience in politics, I think, was very helpful in that area because there were many disputes that took place within the committee. Among the members themselves, there were many disputes that took place between the committee members and the representatives of the debtor. We were adversarial all the time, and so you had to know how to negotiate, you had to know how to maneuver, you had to be fairly articulate. In the early stages, I did a lot of court work, and I think I did fairly well in that area. In the last 2 or 3 years, I practiced for 50 years. In the last 2 or 3 years, I wasn't going into court anymore. But you had to know how to relate to people. It was extremely important, and I think that my experience in politics was tremendously beneficial in that area.
Tell us about your experience in politics.
I decided to go to a meeting in 1954. Never been in politics before, and I was about 28 years of age at that time. And I attended a district meeting, and they made me a delegate to the state convention, and they thought I was a comer, and I went to a caucus, and I started to raise hell, and the first thing they told me was, shut up, sit down, and vote right. That was my first experience in politics. And I said, wait, they can't say that to me. And somebody said, Stuart, shut up, sit down, and vote right. And that started my career. I ran the lieutenant governor's campaign for John Swainson. I was his finance chair in his gubernatorial campaign. I became the finance director of the party and then the treasurer of the party. And then I was the Democratic National Committeeman for about 5-6 years representing Michigan in the National Committee. I attended as a delegate-at-large 6 national conventions, starting with the Kennedy Convention in 1960 and ending with the convention in 1980. And I was also the chair of the Carter delegation to the 1980 convention, and I'm trying to think, there was just, I was head of the President's Club in Michigan. As a result of my activities on a national level, my wife and I attended about 7 functions at the White House, formal dinners, luncheons, and things of that nature. So it was quite an experience, and I think I was active in politics for 1980, 54, for about 26, 27 years, and it's an experience that I'll never forget.
How has political life changed?
I think that they democratized the process so much that it's unwieldy today. The primaries, everybody said after the 1968 convention that we want to let the people make the selection instead of a combination of conventions where the professionals helped select and primaries. We had a combination back in those days. And so every state began to have presidential primaries, and then everybody started to complain about the results of the selection process in presidential primaries, because by the first 2 or 3 primaries after New Hampshire and Iowa, it was all over for all practical purposes. And it took a lot out of the process, a lot of thinking out of the process, a lot of negotiations out of the process, and I think that we would have probably, in many occasions, ended up with better candidates if it was the combination that we had for many, many years, which was a series of state conventions selecting delegates and presidential primaries in certain states, and the combination of two seemed to mesh together in a much better selection process.
Did your activity with Israel and your interest in Israel ever mesh with your activity in politics?
Did it ever mesh with my interest in politics? Well, we set up, I'll never forget, we set up for the first time a Jewish caucus at the national level in the National Committee. Morley Winograd was chairman of the State Central Committee here in Michigan. He was Jewish. Sam Fishman, who was the coordinator for the FL-CIO from the UAW, was Jewish, and between the three of us, we helped set up a Jewish caucus in Michigan, and we participated in the Jewish caucus at a national level. That was about the only contact.
Well, let's start talking about the Jewish community then. When did you start getting involved? Well, you mentioned Avon Cohn earlier.
Well, let me back it up. I went to Israel again the first time in 1967, right after the Six-Day War, and I was absolutely overwhelmed by it. And I began to express an interest and decided that maybe I ought to try to get active within the Jewish community, and that's all Avon Cohn and Mike Zeltzer had to hear. And I think I was national committeeman, or maybe I was still treasurer of the party, but I was an officer of the Democratic Party. And I asked my wife, what do you think? I put in many, many hours there, many hours in the practice of law. Would you object if I got active in the Jewish community? And we talked it over, and we decided I ought to go ahead. And so they set up a luncheon with Bill of Runnan, who was the executive director of the Federation at that time, and Alan Schwartz, who was the president. And we had a luncheon over at the Standard Club. It lasted almost 2 hours, and I was made. I decided I wanted to be active in the Federation. And so somehow, I don't remember, you asked me, one of the questions that you had sent me in the mail, how I selected the Jewish Vocational Service. I think that they told me about the various agencies that were available. They wanted me to get active, and I knew that the Jewish Vocational Service involved developmentally disabled, and it sounded very fascinating, and it was the best decision I made because it was a great agency, and with a great director, Al Asher, at the time, one of the finest directors that I had ever worked with. And so I went on the Jewish Vocational Service, and that was the start of my work in the Jewish community.
You went on to become president of that agency.
I became president of the Jewish Vocational Service and served for a period of 3 years. And then right after that, I became the chair of the Community Service Division, which included as one of its agencies the Jewish Vocational Service. And part of that time, I was also the chair of the attorney section of the Allied Jewish Campaign. And so I was, to me, getting in head first there. I was really starting to get active.
And serving with Federation, you assumed some titles, I believe. You were on the Board of Governors, Vice President.
I was on the Board of Governors. I was on the Executive Committee. I became chairman of the, I don't remember, it was the Community Service, it was the division that held all of the Community Service Division agencies, planning and
Budgeting.
planning what?
Budgeting and planning.
Budgeting and planning. I was chairman of that. I forgot about that. Then I became chairman of the Demographic Committee for the Federation in 1989 or 19, and that was a tremendous experience. And I was a vice president of the Federation for approximately 6 years. And to carry on probably the most thrilling and exciting things I've ever been involved in Federation is when Bob Aronson talked me into becoming chairman of the Israel and Overseas Committee. And how he had to talk me into it, I don't know, because after I got into it, it was just a super thing to do. I was chairman for almost 5 years. I guess they were going to limit it to 3 years, but it was the beginning, and we were breaking in new people. And so I chaired the Partnership 2000 for a 5-year period. That's the one he talked me into, not the Israel and Overseas. And then after I'd served for 5 years as chairman of the Partnership 2000, which was up in the Galilee in Israel, I became chairman of the Israel and Overseas Committee and served 3 years, and today is my last meeting and I go off. And that pretty well covers it. I was on many other committees, chairs of many other committees, but that covers most of my activity.
Let's go back just a moment. The Detroit Jewish Demographic Study. What did you find out as the chairman of that?
Well, that was pretty interesting. We went in thinking that there were 70,000 Jews, because that's what we were told in the last study that had been made 10 or 15 years before that. And we figured that we probably had lost a good number of people, and it was probably down in the 50,000 or 60,000. We were shocked when we found out we had 95,000 Jews. And that was the big surprise of that whole study. And we found that they were in Troy, that they were in Grosse Pointe, in areas that we should have figured they were there, but we didn't realize they were there in that number. And some of them were active. They had a Grosse Pointe club out there made up of Jews. The Troy group was active. So that was the population aspect of that study. But there were interesting issues that came up during that study relating to education, intermarriage, different issues within the community that we then followed up with subcommittees on after the demographic study had been completed.
How did Federation address those issues?
They set up committees and moved on almost all of those issues immediately that came up as a result of that study. They set up subcommittees. The subcommittees then submitted the issues to an overall committee, and then from there it went to the board with recommendations. So there was no question that the study was worthwhile and that we followed through on the study.
Now it's been over 20 years since that study. Was there an impact that that demographic study made on the community that continues to be felt?
Well, I think that in the area of education, there's been tremendous impact, because there's been great emphasis within our community for the last 10 years on education. There's been, well, that was one of the major ones.
How would you like to see the Jewish community address those issues now?
Well, I think they've done a fairly good job up till now. We have a Jewish high school. Hillel is extremely strong. The rabbis within the community have been working well with the Federation, the Jewish education there is an Alliance for Jewish Education that's working very strongly in that particular area, and to me, that is one of the most important subjects that confronts the Federation, and I think they jumped on it and they've stayed on top of it. But the main thing is that we have coalesced in the community where there is a good relationship between the Orthodox, the Conservative, and the Reform, and that certainly helps within this community.
I'd like to go back to your experience on the Israel and Overseas Committee and some of the missions that you've participated in. There was a mission, I believe, to Romania that you
Yeah, I represented Detroit. It was the first allocations mission that had been sponsored by the UJA, and we went to Romania. My wife accompanied me, Romania, into Israel, but that wasn't part of Israel and Overseas because Israel and Overseas Committee only started approximately 4 years ago. But that was the first mission I went on. My wife and I chaired the mission that went over there in 2001, and I'll never forget that mission. That was the one where we went over there in September of 2001 to support our friends in Israel, and we were there one day, and we were up in the region, and the 9/11 happened, and before we were through, they were all supporting us and helping us to get through it over there. So we were on that mission. I was on the first miracle mission, and they've been great experiences. I think the missions are, if a person goes for the first time, and I know what it was like when I went in '67, it has tremendous impact. And we had many first-timers on all the missions that I went on.
Are there any particular human interest, any experiences that one-on-one that you recall?
Well, the anecdotal, probably the most interesting experience is what happened at the 2001 mission, where we were over there and we were stunned by what happened in the United States on September 11th. Other than that, through Partnership 2000, we developed some very close personal relationships and had exchanges where we went to Israel, and many of the people there, the officials and people who were active as volunteers, came to the United States, and we called those exchanges, and they were very successful and became the backbone, I think, of Partnership 2000, the strength of Partnership 2000. So I have many friends up there in the Galilee, and as a matter of fact, we're having a 10th reunion of members of the steering committee in November, and I'm going over on that reunion, and I look forward to meeting many of the people that I had worked with over a period of almost 8 years, because I was on that committee for about 3 years after I was chairman. So there were lots of personal relationships we had. Then I also served on the Jewish Agency, and I went to I served on the United Israel Appeal Board, that's right, representing Michigan, and went over to Israel as a delegate to Jewish Agency meetings and developed lots of relationships. And I would say that I've probably been to Israel 18, 19 times over the last 9 or 10 years, and they've all been a great experience.
Do your children share your interest?
Not my oldest son was active for a while on the attorneys committee. I think he was co-chair one year, and whereas they identify, no question, they identify as Jews, and they attend the synagogues or temples. They haven't as yet become active beyond, my son Bob, wait a minute, I forgot about this. My son Bob was on the Jewish Vocational Service Board, was a vice president of that board, and probably eventually would have become president, but he became president just about that time of International INSAL, which was a international organization, and he just couldn't spread himself that thin. So he did carry on. He got active. My other children are interested in the community, but did not actually get active within Federation work.
Tell me a little more about them and their families.
All three of them are attorneys. My son Bob and my son John practice law in the city of Detroit, and my daughter Kathy practices law in Chicago. My daughter Kathy started out at a teacher's college, went from there and got a master's in social work, and decided she wanted to become a lawyer, and that was enough, and after that she started practicing law. My other two boys have been involved in the law for various periods of time. I'm trying to think. I think my son Bob has been a lawyer for about 25 years, and my son John has probably been a lawyer now for about 22 years, something to that effect. So they're all actively practicing. I practiced for 50 years and then retired. Found it a great experience, and I hope they're finding it a good experience.
Tell us about Marilyn.
Marilyn, she had 3 children to bring up. She quit college at the time that we were married. She had 3 children to bring up. When the third became old enough to leave with somebody, she decided to go back to college, and she got her master's in social work at Wayne University, and she went to work for the Jewish Family Service. I think it was 25 years. I believe she was there 25 years. Maybe it was longer than that. She retired at the same time that I did. At the time that she retired, she was in charge of many special projects for the Jewish Family Service, and she felt a great sense of responsibility, and she enjoyed her work. And now that she's a layperson, she's chair of the Single Jewish Parent Committee, which was one that she had staffed when she had worked for the Federation.
Now, we have a lot of challenges in the Jewish community today. Do you have any observations about those? And
well, I did not work on the campaign. I think one of the major challenges is to try to determine how we maximize the participation in the campaign by young people today. There are a lot of active young people who are involved in the campaigns and who are substantial givers. But overall, I don't think the response today has been as it was when I was a young person. And that is something that has to be solved. I think it's very important. I think we've set up some substantial endowments as a result of the incredible work that Bob Aronson has done over the last 3 or 4 years. And so we're building up an endowment for the Federation, and we'll be able to supplement some of the money that we're not raising or will not raise in the kind of quantities that we did before. I think it's important, extremely important, to continue the work that the Alliance for Jewish Education is doing, because I think Jewish education is going to be the lifeblood of this community and keeping the young people within the community. I am personally troubled by the number of intermarriages, which is evident from the demographic study that was just performed on a national level, which confirmed 7 or 8 years later what we found in our demographic study here, a substantial amount of intermarriages, and I find that troubling. And there are a lot of issues within the community, and I think we're attacking all of them through various commissions and committees.
have you any life's lessons that you would want to share with your children, your families?
Life lessons. I have, although it took away a substantial amount of time that I possibly could have spent with the family, or probably would have spent with the family, I think it was very important that I was involved in the Jewish community. I think it's extremely important that I was involved in the political arena. It helped me in many, many areas. There's politics in everything you do, and you learn how to react, etc. And I would think that the people who are engaged in business or in professions would have other alternative things that keep them interested and keep them busy. I found it very meaningful in my life. Unfortunately, and I'm sure my wife is probably going to see this video, unfortunately it did take me away for a period of time from activities I could have been carrying on with the family, but I tried to maximize that relationship with the time that I did have. My kids, my children, are active in various enterprises, all my children, and which I think is good.
Are there any questions I haven't asked you? Anything that you'd like to mention?
Not really. I can't believe that we covered the amount of ground that we did in the short time we had. Not really. I think we've covered everything.